Hello, everyone. This is Terry Smith. Welcome to the Terry Smith Show. This is episode 5. And today I'm going to be doing the Gettysburg Address by President Abraham Lincoln, given on Thursday, November 19th in the year 1863. 1863 was a busy year for Lincoln. Well, I guess they all were, but that was the year of the battle at Gettysburg, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863. And he also gave his Thanksgiving Day proclamation in October of 1863. And then on this Thursday of November 19th, he gave the Gettysburg Address. So I'm going to give the Gettysburg Address and then give a few comments on it, a few notes on it, some background, some context, and then do the speech again after you get a little more insight into it, and I hope the comments will help that. You can support the show by, and by golly, why wouldn't you want to support the show? By donating funds, money to, I guess the best way to do it is my Venmo, Terrence Smith -17. So Terrence, Terrence, no A's in there. Terrence Smith -17. And you'll notice I have this bow tie on today. If you're looking at the video website, the videos of videos of the speeches can be found at my website, theterrysmithshow.com. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, it's just the audio, of course. So if you want to see the videos, it kind of shows you that I am doing the speeches from memory. Even though it's video, there's probably be a way to sneak it if you wanted to deceive the viewer and that you don't have it memorized. But a little more belief and confirmation that I'm doing it from memory for what that's worth. I think it helps to know it from memory as opposed to just reading something. So, but like I said, I'm wearing the bow tie only because I had the bow tie on for the Winston Churchill speech in episode 4, and I found a good tip. I was just practicing doing the bow tie again. I found a video on YouTube. You could look it up. I'm sure there's plenty out there. But the key to making a good, nice, tight bow tie for tying a real bow tie, not the clip-on type, is after you come down that first, you take the one end of the bow tie over the other end at your neck. You tie it, you pull it tight. That's an important ingredient. But then after you put the first two ends of the one bow tie in there, by bringing them together, the butterfly wings, bringing them together and holding them, that's the key. That is the key to getting a good bow tie and make it a lot less confusing than if you try to follow diagrams on just a poster, or for example, you see the video and it's holding the two ends together and then taking the other end of the bow tie, folding it over and sticking it through there's a hole back there. After you hold the two wings of the bow tie, you pull that through and then you just have to adjust it. So a little bow tie work there for you. So the first run at the Gettysburg Address, given by President Abraham Lincoln, November 19th, 1863. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense, We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The Gettysburg Address. Okay, just a couple comments I'd like to make about the Gettysburg Address. It was given in November, as I said, November 19th on a Thursday. It was 4 months after the battle itself, which was in July of 1863, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, not the 4th. And the main speaker at the graveyard there was already a graveyard in Gettysburg, and they added a section for the soldiers that had died during the battle, and it took a while to get them all the bodies in order from one location and identifying them, and there's also some scheduling conflicts, I think, with the main speaker, that the featured speaker at the memorial that day in November was Edward Everett, and he was like the most popular speaker of the day at that time, and so he was the main speaker that spoke before President Lincoln, and he spoke for 2 hours, and then Lincoln got up and spoke for a little more than 2 minutes. And Edward Everett was quite an accomplished man. He was the governor of Massachusetts. He's from Massachusetts. He was a legislator in the United States Congress for a number of terms, and was also a United States senator. He, did I say governor of Massachusetts? And he's also the president of Harvard, and he was Secretary of State under Fillmore's presidency. So he was educated in different places in Europe, and was quite an orator. And even that 2-hour speech he gave from, I understand he didn't have notes even for that speech. So anyway, but being kind of the second banana there, you won't see that very often, or any time in the current day of presidents. Reading Calvin Coolidge's autobiography, he went into how when he became president, he could no longer accept social invitations, and he couldn't go to a Kiwanis meeting, to where someone else that was being, wherever he went, the president, he had to be the person that was being honored. He couldn't go to another dinner or event where someone else was being honored, because he's the president. He outranks everyone in the cabinet. He's the chief of the Army and Navy, and so wherever he goes, he has to be the person of honor. He can have people over the White House and things like that, but and it's more of a, as he states in his autobiography, it's not because it's of his own desires. It's like the office. You have to be respectful of everybody's equality. Like, he can't accept, there might be 50 nights where the president's not occupied with some official duties. So if he were, he gets all kinds of invitations to come to certain events, and he could only do that on a personal level, and that would just be not the right protocol or etiquette for a president to, it would be accused of people currying favor with him, etc. So um, the fact that Edward Everett was the main speaker and Lincoln was essentially the secondary speaker, that wouldn't happen in this day and age, or even since the time of Coolidge, who was in 1923. So I thought that was interesting. That compared to how presidents have to go with protocol today, or ever since sometime after Lincoln, apparently. And well, the speech itself, four score and seven. That of course is that a score is 20, so it's 20 years, and four score is 80, so four score and seven is 87 years, and that was 87 previous to 1863 would put you at 1776. So that's when the four score and 7 years ago our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. So that's the reference there. My wife Erin and I and one son Charlie went to Gettysburg a few years back. Our other three boys were off doing something else, so it was just the three of us at that time. Went to Gettysburg and also went to Washington D.C. At the same time. Saw some of the museums down there in D.C. So that was a good thing. Actually, I'm proud of Charlie. He took on a speech. He was working one summer. He went to Ohio University, a degree in accounting. And one of the summers he was working as a security guard at a local yacht club and had some time on his hands in the booth there, between cars coming in and out of the yacht club. He worked on a speech that Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, and I'll leave a reference to that. There's a YouTube out there that my son Charlie memorized the passage there from the movie Gettysburg that Jeff Daniels portrayed Colonel Joshua Chamberlain. So I think that's about it. There were over 7,000 Union and Confederate soldiers killed at Gettysburg, the bloodiest battle of the Civil War. The bloodiest one-day battle was at Antietam, where there's over like 3,600 killed in one day. So I made one little stumble in the initial recitation of the speech, but I could have erased it and done it again. But it's okay to have a little mistake for something like this. And I'll see if I can perfect it on the following recitation of the Gettysburg Address. It's always good for those people out there looking to maybe possibly do something like this themselves. When you do get it completely right, it's not so much that you got it right, it's that it all flows correctly, and it's more like a work of art when you get it done kind of perfectly the way it should be done. So that's rewarding when you get it done without making any stumbles or mistakes. Some people think a little mistake makes something perfect, like when people used to dress, they used to not wear a cufflink or something, and it's like, well, you don't want to be totally perfect. Totally perfect is having one little error, so think of it like that. So we'll just go on to a second recitation then, and see if I can get this second one done properly. And again, you can see I mentioned, I'll put a link on the web page, the page where I have the videos. That's theterrysmithshow.com, and I'll put a link there to Charlie's rendition of Colonel Joshua Chamberlain's speech at Gettysburg at the Battle of Little Round Top. Two more things I'd like to mention regarding the Gettysburg Address. Lincoln, of course, wanted to remember the soldiers that had died there, but another big reason for him to go to Gettysburg to speak was to impress upon the nation, the Union at the time, that there was still a lot of fighting to be done. This was, as I said, as we know, the speech itself was in November of 1863, and the end of the war won't be until April 9th of 1865. So almost 2 years will pass from the time of the Gettysburg Address, or the Gettysburg Battle itself, at least. Almost 2 years from that time will the end of the war come. And so he wanted to impress upon the people, the people there, of course, where there was a good sized crowd, but also through the newspaper reports that were inevitable that would report on what happened there. And so his speech, the main content of it is to tell the people, it is for us a living to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. So he wanted us to take on with equal enthusiasm to continue fighting until the Union States were victorious. And the other thing, just as a sidebar, there's the end of the mention in the end of the Civil War, April 9th. That's when in 1865. That's when the Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, a city down in Virginia, I think. And there's a humorized, version of that surrender in James Thurber's play called Thurber's Carnival. And I had the good fortune of playing James Thurber in that play in Gates Mills a few years back. And I will have a podcast where I go through Thurber's initial act of that play, where he tries to sign up for, entering in World War I, but his eyes were so bad that he couldn't make it. But that's another act in that same play, though, is the surrender of Robert E. Lee, and with General Grant for the Union, Ulysses S. Grant meeting Robert E. Lee at the Appomattox and accepting his surrender. I say humorous version of the surrender, with the understanding that Ulysses S. Grant, of course, was quite a drinker. So James Thurber, takes that into account in his rendition of the surrender. And James Thurber himself was from Ohio, born in Columbus. And he writes about some of his life's experiences growing up in Columbus. There is a museum there for those of you interested in learning more about James Thurber. He was quite influential. He was a humorist. He wrote for the Atlantic magazine, I believe, and was a cartoonist and influenced a number of comedians, Steve Allen being one of them, I remember. Correction, the magazine that Thurber wrote for was the New Yorker magazine. One last thing I'd like to say about the Gettysburg Address and Edward Everett. He was wondering about how his speech compared with Lincoln's, and he wrote Lincoln a letter after the speech, and in that letter he said, "I flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." And then Lincoln responded to Everett's letter. In those days, mail was sometimes delivered 2 or 3 times a day, and probably more so with the president. So I'll read some part of his response, Abraham Lincoln's response to Edward Everett. He said, "My dear sir, your kind note of today is received in our respective parts. Yesterday, you could not have been excused to make a short address, nor I a long one. I am pleased to know that in your judgment the little I did say was not entirely a failure." So a nice, gracious interaction there between the two speakers on the day of the Gettysburg Address. And now the second recitation of President Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And that concludes President Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, November 19th, 1863.